Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of Defense Decades on Bharat Shakti. I am Nitin Gokhale. Over the past 4 weeks, we have covered the decades from the independence of India in 1947 till 1977 and looked at major military operations and turning points in India's military history. As we move ahead with this series, we are covering the very crucial decade of 1987 to 1997, in which there have been several turning points in India's military history. In some of our past episodes, we spoke about the full-fledged wars, 1962, the 1947-48, 1965, 1971, all of that. But in this episode, I'm going to cover a different kind of a conflict, but equally important in India's recent military history. We're talking about standalone operations in the Indian military, which started with perhaps Operation Pavan, which lasted for 3 years between 1987 and 1990 in Sri Lanka. This was also India's first out-of-area contingency. That means going out of the Indian borders and fighting there for whatever cause there was in that war. As all of you are aware, the July 1987 accord between India and Sri Lanka was to bring peace or try and bring peace in the north and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka, because the Tamil militancy or insurgency was on in those areas, and the Indian military which went in there was ironically called the Indian Peacekeeping Force. This was supposed to be Rajiv Gandhi, the then Prime Minister's biggest or shining achievements, because he was going on and on signing different accords domestically. All of you will recall the 1986 Mizoram Accord, 1985 Assam Accord, 1987 Darjeeling Accord, the 1987 Punjab Accord, and then he got sort of swept away by the euphoria of some of these accords and also tried to do the same thing in Sri Lanka. But in an ironical twist, the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, in fact, did not end and turned out to be Rajiv Gandhi's biggest blunder, costing him his life later in 1991, which we'll talk about on some other episode perhaps. The accord, the India-Sri Lanka Accord, envisaged ceasefire between belligerent parties and surrender of weapons of the armed Tamil militants. But within weeks, the Indian military, which went there with a lot of goodwill and was received with a lot of goodwill by the Tamil people in Jaffna in the north and Batticaloa and the other place, Trincomalee, were seen as oppressors, and they had to turn into what is called Indian peace enforcers. Instead of just peacekeeping force, they had to become enforcers of the accord, and then of course began to take on the militant groups. And in that process, India lost over 1,200 soldiers who were killed, 3,000 were badly wounded, and about 100,000 or 1 lakh troops that were deployed in that area in Sri Lanka between 1987 and 1990 actually exceeded the number of people deployed in Kargil later in 1999. This peacetime military exercise or the military operation in Sri Lanka also coincided with one of the biggest exercises done by any military in the Indian subcontinent. Now, of course, there are only two big militaries in the Indian subcontinent, India and Pakistan. And this took place in the desert areas of Rajasthan, just some miles away, maybe 50 to 100 miles away from the Pakistan border. This was called Operation Brasstacks, which was conceived by one of India's most celebrated cerebral generals, General Krishnaswamy Sundarji, who was the army chief. He wanted to test and experiment the new maneuver concept of armor being deployed, and armor or armored brigades and armor forces crossing the deserts at top speed and covering a distance of 100, 200 kilometers in a day, which actually rattled Pakistan and also made headlines around the world, which turned into a crisis between India and Pakistan, one of the big crises in India-Pakistan history. It lasted, like I said, from November 1986 to January 1987, which itself shows how big and wide this exercise was. 500,000 army personnel with their tanks and BMPs were positioned about 180 kilometers of Pakistan border, triggering a full-scale war. That's how it was seen by many writers and strategic thinkers at that point in time. And that was not the only big significant event in the decade between 1987 and 1997. Coincidentally, the second out-of-area contingency operation, albeit a small one, was launched in 1988 called Operation Cactus. In November 1988, a group of Maldivian officers or Maldivian citizens, along with mercenaries who were Sri Lankan militants and, of course, mercenaries for hire, captured the President's Palace in Malé, which is the capital of Maldives, in an attempted coup against the then President Mahmoud Abdul Gayoom, who immediately requested for military intervention from India. Sri Lanka, which is the closest neighbor of Maldives, denied any help. So did Pakistan and other countries like Singapore and the United States or even the UK. They were unable to provide any immediate assistance. So India immediately launched Operation Cactus, and an IL-76 transport aircraft airlifted a detachment of Para Brigade, the 50th or the 50 Parachute Brigade, and took them to Malé. Incidentally, the Indian detachment of the Para Brigade, led by Brigadier Farooq Balsara, did not have any military maps of Maldives. They depended on tourist maps which were there. They took off from Agra, landed at Malé, which was luckily still not under the control of the mercenaries. And within hours, after a meticulously planned and coordinated operation, they actually restored order in the capital of Maldives within 48 hours, securing the country's stability and, of course, making sure that President Gayoom was safe and was reinstalled in the seat of power. This decade also saw something that is still sort of simmering, or was simmering till about 2019, and that was the insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir. The turning point in the insurgency of Jammu and Kashmir came in the 1987 state assembly elections. 75% of the voters actually voted, but it was widely seen as a heavily rigged election in favor of the National Conference, led by Farooq Abdullah, who was an ally of Rajiv Gandhi and the Congress Party. And that set off a set of events, or triggered a set of events which the after effects of which lasted almost over 30 years in Jammu and Kashmir. The political opposition was given a go-by. Several young activists who were in politics that time got disillusioned, and they all went into insurgency. JKLF leader Yasin Malik, for instance, or Yusuf Shah's election agent, he became a separatist leader of the Hizbul Mujahideen. And in 1989, just a year after the assembly, or 2 years after the assembly elections, the JKLF militants or terrorists later kidnapped Rubayya Saeed, the daughter of the then Home Minister of India, Mufti Muhammad Saeed, who had sort of moved to the center after being a political leader in J&K. That led to release of many imprisoned terrorist and militant leaders, which led to subsequently several other developments which we are all familiar with. Of course, these violence spread, it spiraled out of control, and it became a militant insurgency in 1989. Now, Pakistan was waiting in the wings. Like we have seen in the run-up to the 1965 war, Pakistan loves to fish in troubled waters. They thought it's a ripe moment to incite insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir, promote separatism, and ultimately annex J&K. And the assistance provided by President Zia-ul-Haq, who was also the army chief under Operation Topak, actually aided and abetted J&K insurgency. Arms were made available, several groups sprouted, militant groups, Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, Hizbul Mujahideen, led by Syed Salahuddin, who is now holed up in Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, All-Party Hurriyat Conference, Jamaat-e-Islami. All of these people started fishing in troubled waters, encouraged, abetted and supported by Pakistan. The militants began an ethnic cleansing of the Hindus in Jammu and Kashmir, and more than 400,000, 4 lakh Hindus were forced to leave their homes from 1987 onwards. And more than 1,000 Kashmiri Pandits were brutally massacred, tortured, their houses were destroyed, taken over by the militants. And by 1990, the government declared a state of emergency and dissolved the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly, National Assembly. And Operation Rakshak was then launched in June 1990. The Indian Army had just started returning, or complements of the Indian Army or sections of the Indian Army were returning from Sri Lanka and were recovering from the operation at the China border in Sundarangchu, which had happened in 1986, which we referred to in the previous episode. Now, that's where Indian Army's involvement in what is called CICT, counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism operations in Jammu and Kashmir began. And they had to take on additional responsibility from guarding the line of control to counter-terrorism in their own land. Although in Northeast, the army had some experience of counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism, Jammu and Kashmir was a completely different kettle of fish because Pakistan was heavily involved, actively involved. So the then Army Chief and the then Director General Military Operations, Lieutenant General B.C. Joshi, who later went on to become the Chief, actually raised the Rashtriya Rifles as a specialized counter-insurgency unit in the Indian Army, which began to then grow roots in Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, simultaneously, General Joshi and his staff also conceived something called Operation Sadbhavna, Goodwill, in 1998. Of course, not General Joshi, because by the time he had passed away in harness, but the idea had sprouted from his approach, a twin approach that he had mandated, that there will be hard power used against known and gunmen and terrorists and militants, but also the local awam or the janta will be given comfort under what is called the Winning Hearts and Minds campaign of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Numerous activities under that: quality education, women's empowerment, community development, health infrastructure, all that was provided. Then comes, of course, the year of 1994, 1995. J&K witnessed Yasin Malik as a leader of JKLF, declaring his aim for attaining independence for Jammu and Kashmir. And they started sort of propagating Kashmir as a dispute between India and Pakistan. In that decade, India really went to the precipice internationally and otherwise. It came under pressure for human rights violations. It came under pressure from the local population, which was caught between the army or the Rashtriya Rifles and the militants. That's what happened in Jammu and Kashmir, and it continued till 2019 until Article 370 was removed. And of course, it still remains one of the hot spots in India. What we saw in Pahalgam was a manifestation of all these years of insurgency, killing, ransom, and Pakistan's attempt to keep the insurgency boiling. Cut to Northeast, the All Assam Students' Union, which had begun its agitation in 1979 against illegal influx of Bangladeshis, continued that what was called the anti-foreigners agitation. They, of course, prefer it to be called movement and not an agitation. They signed an accord with the central government of Rajiv Gandhi in August 1985. Elections were held thereafter immediately, and the installation of a new, fresh government in Assam happened under youth leaders like Prafulla Kumar Mahanta and Raghu Kumar Phukan, which later led to the fall of the AGP, the Assam Gana Parishad. But that's a distant memory now. And because of that agitation, another agitation started, or movement started in the Bodo-dominated areas. Bodo, the tribals in the lower Assam area of Assam, where they started feeling discriminated against. And the All Bodo Students Union and the Bodo People's Action Committee signed an accord with the central government. But that didn't last too long. That was not found satisfactory. Organizations like the National Democratic Front of Bodoland and Bodo Liberation Tigers came up. They became insurgents, taking a cue out of the other insurgencies in the northeast. And of course, the ULFA, or the United Liberation Front of Assam, also then reached out to the ISI in Pakistan through Bangladesh. They generated an insurgency, or sort of controlled insurgency in Assam, which lasted for almost 20 years. I was based in Assam at that point in time. The army had to be called in November 1990. Operation Bajrang was launched, followed by Operation Bajrang in Operation Rhino in September 1991, which then, of course, brought the insurgency under control. But the manifestations and the after effects and the fallout of the insurgency remained in Assam for almost another 15 years, which, of course, has now become a distant memory. And another operation had to be taken because or taken up by the Indian Army in December 2003, when all these fleeing terrorists or insurgents from the northeast, especially from Assam, had taken shelter in neighboring Bhutan. Now, Bhutan shares boundary with Assam, West Bengal, and it's easy to cross over into Bhutan at that point in time. They were holed up there, so Indian Army helped the Bhutanese army to evict and arrest some of those terrorists and militants who were holed up in Bhutan, which was seen as an operation that was largely carried out by the Bhutanese army under Operation All Clear. But stops were provided by the Indian army in the border areas of Assam and West Bengal. And that is also a decade when India's missile journey, indigenous missile journey began, where the first flight of Prithvi missile took place in February 1988. By 1989, a prototype of or a demonstrator of the Agni long-range missile was carried out by India under the leadership of the man who came to be known as the Missile Man of India, APJ Abdul Kalam, who was then in the Defence Research and Development Organization, later went on to become President of India. But very eventful year, multiple layers of military actions, outright military operations, exercises, counter-insurgency grids to be put in place, trying to control your own population and evict terrorists and militants from your own soil and those who had fled in the neighboring areas. All that happened in this decade between 1987 and 1997. Just after this decade began, the insurgency had begun in Assam, and I sort of came up with the first book in 1998. This is where it focuses, it's called The Hot Brew, focuses on the militancy in Assam, which was targeting the tea industry, and therefore the name The Hot Brew. If you get a chance, buy it in Guwahati. Otherwise, it's available on my personal website, nitinegokhale.com. Don't forget to send your comments. We need more and more people to watch this program, because I try and bring a flavor of the years gone past. and try and update you, or at least make you interested in India's recent military history. That's all I have this time. Keep watching Bharat Shakti. Goodbye for now.